Jae-hwan's eyes snapped open as the sound of shattering glass filled the air. He sat up with a start, his heart racing, and looked around frantically. Where was he? What was happening? He was met with the sight of chaos and destruction. The once familiar streets of Seoul were now a war zone. Buildings were on fire, cars were overturned, and people were running for their lives. Jae-hwan's memories came flooding back. He was a soldier, stationed in Seoul. And now, it seemed, the city was under attack by something. He leapt to his feet, grabbing his rifle and preparing to defend himself. But as he looked around, he realized that he was not alone. There were other survivors scattered throughout the streets. And then, he saw her. A young woman, running towards him with a look of terror in her eyes. Jae-hwan's heart skipped a beat as he recognized her. It was his girlfriend, Ji-hyun. Jae-hwan, she screamed, running into his arms. What's happening? What's going on? Jae-hwan held her close, trying to protect her from the chaos around them. I don't know, he said, his voice shaking. But we have to get out of here. Now! As they turned to run, Jae-hwan caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. A horde of things, creatures, was coming towards them. Their eyes were empty, their skin was gray, and their mouths were open, revealing razor-sharp teeth. Zombies, Jae-hwan whispered, his voice trembling with fear. Ji-hyun's eyes widened in horror. What do we do? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jae-hwan's grip on his rifle tightened. We fight, he said, his eyes locked on the approaching horde. We fight to survive. Jae-hwan and Ji-hyun sprinted through the streets, dodging debris and leaping over obstacles. The zombies were closing in, their moans and groans growing louder. As they ran, Jae-hwan's training kicked in. He scanned their surroundings, looking for a safe place to hole up. That's when he spotted it, a small alleyway between two buildings. In here, he yelled, grabbing Ji-hyun's hand and pulling her into the alley. They paused for a moment, catching their breath. But Jae-hwan knew they couldn't stay there for long. The zombies would find them. He peeked around the corner, scanning the street. That's when he saw it, a military truck, speeding down the street. Jae-hwan's heart leapt with hope. Ji-hyun, look, he exclaimed, pointing to the truck. But as they watched, the truck swerved out of control, crashing into a nearby building. Jae-hwan's heart sank. No, he muttered, feeling a wave of despair wash over him. But Ji-hyun's grip on his hand tightened. We have to keep moving, she said, her voice firm. Jae-hwan nodded, taking a deep breath. They had to keep fighting. As they emerged from the alley, Jae-hwan spotted a group of survivors, huddled together in fear. He also saw something else, a horde of zombies, closing in on the survivors. Without hesitation, Jae-hwan charged forward, rifle at the ready. Take cover, he yelled to the survivors. The zombies were relentless, but Jae-hwan fought back with every ounce of strength he had. Ji-hyun fought alongside him, using a nearby pipe to take down zombies. As the fight raged on, Jae-hwan's thoughts turned to their chances of survival. Were they doomed to die in this godforsaken city? And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the fight was over. The zombies lay motionless on the ground, and the survivors cheered. But Jae-hwan's relief was short-lived. As he turned to Ji-hyun, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A figure, standing in the shadows, watching them. A figure with eyes that glowed like embers. Ji-hyun, Jae-hwan whispered, his voice trembling with fear. We're not alone. Ji-hyun's eyes widened in terror as she stared at the figure in the shadows. What is that? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Jae-hwan's grip on his rifle tightened. I don't know, he said, his voice low and menacing. But we're going to find out. As they cautiously approached the figure, Jae-hwan noticed something strange. The figure didn't seem to be moving, but its eyes seemed to be fixed on them. Suddenly, the figure stepped forward, its eyes glowing brighter in the dark. Jae-hwan and Ji-hyun froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. Who are you? Jae-hwan demanded, trying to keep his voice steady. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised its hand, and Jae-hwan saw something that made his blood run cold. A small device was attached to the figure's wrist, emitting a strange signal. Jae-hwan's mind racing, he realized that this device might be the key to understanding what was happening in the city. Without hesitation, Jae-hwan reached out and grabbed the device, ripping it off the figure's wrist. The figure didn't react, but its eyes seemed to flash with anger. "What have you done?" Ji-hyun whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Jae-hwan examined the device, trying to understand its purpose. But as he looked up, he saw something that made his heart sink. The figure had vanished, leaving behind only a faint trail of smoke. Jae-hwan and Ji-hyun were left staring at each other, unsure of what to do next. "We need to get out of here," Jae-hwan said finally, his voice firm. "We need to find a way to stop whatever is happening in this city." Ji-hyun nodded, her eyes still wide with fear. "But where do we go?" she asked. Jae-hwan hesitated, unsure of the answer. But as he looked at Ji-hyun, he knew that he would do whatever it took to keep her safe. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice filled with determination. "Together." As they navigated through the deserted streets, Jae-hwan and Ji-hyun stumbled upon a small group of survivors. They were huddled together, frightened and unsure of what to do. Jae-hwan immediately took charge, assessing the situation and coming up with a plan. "We need to find a safe place to hide," he said, his voice firm and authoritative. "Somewhere we can regroup and figure out what's going on." One of the survivors, a young woman named Sophia, spoke up. "I know a place," she said, her voice trembling. "A building not far from here. It's secure, and we can barricade ourselves inside." Jae-hwan nodded, his eyes scanning the surrounding area. "Let's move," he said, his voice low and urgent. As they made their way to the building, Jae-hwan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He kept looking over his shoulder, expecting to see the figure in the shadows again. But there was nothing. When they arrived at the building, Jae-hwan was relieved to see that it was indeed secure. They barricaded themselves inside, using furniture and debris to block the doors and windows. As they caught their breath, Jae-hwan turned to Ji-hyun. "We need to figure out what's going on," he said, his voice filled with determination. "We need to find a way to stop this." Ji-hyun nodded, her eyes locked on his. "We will," she said, her voice firm. "Together." But as they began to discuss their plan, Jae-hwan couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The figure in the shadows was still out there, watching and waiting. And Jae-hwan had a feeling that their next encounter would be deadly. As they settled in for the night, Jae-hwan couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The building seemed secure, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He decided to take a closer look around the building, searching for any signs of danger. As he moved through the darkened hallways, he stumbled upon a hidden room. Inside, he found a series of computers and surveillance equipment. It looked like someone had been monitoring the city's security systems from this very room. Jae-hwan's eyes widened as he realized the implications. Someone had been watching the city, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He quickly called out to Ji-hyun and the others, gathering them around the computers. Together, they began to dig through the data, searching for any clues that might lead them to the source of the outbreak. As they scrolled through the files, they stumbled upon a shocking revelation. The outbreak wasn't a natural disaster, it was a man-made catastrophe. A group of rogue scientists had been conducting secret experiments in the city, using a deadly virus to create a new breed of super soldiers. But something had gone horribly wrong. The virus had mutated, spreading rapidly throughout the city and turning its victims into violent, zombie-like creatures. Jae-hwan's eyes locked onto the screen, his mind reeling with the implications. They had to stop the scientists, and they had to do it fast. But as they turned to leave, they were met with a shocking sight. The figure in the shadows was standing in the doorway, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly intensity. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, its voice low and menacing. Jae-hwan's heart sank. They were trapped. The figure began to move towards them, its eyes fixed on Jae-hwan and Ji-hyun. Jae-hwan instinctively raised his rifle, ready to defend himself and the others. But as the figure drew closer, Jae-hwan saw something that made his blood run cold. The figure was not a zombie, but a human being, or at least, it had once been human. Its skin was gray and decaying, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Jae-hwan realized that this must be one of the scientist's creations, a super soldier gone horribly wrong. "You're one of them," Jae-hwan spat, his voice filled with disgust. "One of the scientist's creations." The figure didn't respond. Instead, it kept moving towards them, its eyes fixed on Jae-hwan and Ji-hyun. Jae-hwan knew they had to act fast. He raised his rifle and fired, hitting the figure in the chest. But to his horror, the figure didn't fall. Instead, it kept coming, its eyes glowing brighter with every step. "It's not going to stop," Ji-hyun whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "What do we do?" Jae-hwan's mind was racing. He knew they had to get out of there, fast. But as he turned to run, he felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Sophia, one of the survivors. "I think I know what's going on," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think I know how to stop it." Jae-hwan turned to her, his eyes locked on hers. "What is it?" he demanded. Sophia took a deep breath. "I used to work in the lab where they were creating these things. I know how to shut down the experiment." Jae-hwan's eyes narrowed. "Tell me," he said, his voice firm. Sophia nodded. "But we have to be careful. If we don't shut it down exactly right, it could make things worse." Jae-hwan nodded. "Let's do it." Sophia led them through the winding streets, avoiding the hordes of zombies and other dangers that lurked in every alleyway. Finally, they arrived at the lab where Sophia had worked. The building was a nondescript concrete structure, with steel doors and narrow windows. Sophia produced a keycard and swiped it through the reader, and the doors slid open with a hiss. Inside, the lab was dimly lit, the only sound the hum of machinery and the faint scent of disinfectant. Sophia led them to a central console, where a bank of computers and monitors displayed a dizzying array of data. "This is the control center," Sophia explained, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "From here, we can access the entire experiment." Jae-hwan's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean by the experiment?" he asked. Sophia hesitated. "I'm not sure I should tell you," she said. "But I think you have a right to know." Ji-hyun stepped forward. "Tell us," she said, her voice firm. Sophia took a deep breath. "The experiment was designed to create a new breed of super soldiers," she said. "Using a combination of genetic engineering and advanced robotics, we were trying to create soldiers who could withstand even the most extreme conditions." Jae-hwan's eyes widened. "And what went wrong?" he asked. Sophia's face fell. "The virus we were using to enhance the soldiers' abilities, it mutated. It spread beyond the lab, infecting the entire city." Ji-hyun's eyes flashed with anger. "You did this," she spat. "You and your scientists." Sophia shook her head. "I didn't know," she said. "I swear, I didn't know what they were planning." Jae-hwan's grip on his rifle tightened. "We'll deal with that later," he said. "First, we need to shut down the experiment." Sophia nodded. "I can do that," she said. "But we need to be careful. If we don't do it exactly right, it could make things worse." Jae-hwan nodded. "Let's do it." As Sophia began to work on shutting down the experiment, Jae-hwan and Ji-hyun stood guard, watching the doors and windows for any signs of danger. But as they waited, Jae-hwan couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Sophia's fingers flew across the keyboard as she worked to shut down the experiment. Jae-hwan and Ji-hyun stood guard, their eyes scanning the room for any signs of danger. As they waited, Jae-hwan's mind began to wander. He thought about his life before the outbreak, about his family and friends. He wondered if any of them were still alive. Ji-hyun's voice brought him back to reality. "Jae-hwan, I think I see something," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the window. Jae-hwan followed her gaze, and his heart sank. A horde of zombies was shambling towards the lab, their eyes fixed on the building. "We have to get out of here, now," Jae-hwan said, his voice low and urgent. Sophia looked up from the computer, her eyes wide with fear. "I'm almost done," she said. "Just a few more seconds." Jae-hwan nodded. "Do it." Sophia's fingers flew across the keyboard, and the computers beeped in response. The machinery in the lab began to shut down, and the lights flickered and died. As the lab plunged into darkness, Jae-hwan grabbed Ji-hyun's hand and pulled her towards the door. "Let's go," he whispered. But as they reached the door, they were met with a shocking sight. The zombies had already surrounded the building, their eyes glowing in the dark. Jae-hwan's heart sank. They were trapped. Jae-hwan's mind racing, he quickly assessed their situation. They were trapped, surrounded by zombies with no clear escape route. But he refused to give up. He knew they had to keep moving, no matter what. "Follow me," he whispered to Ji-hyun and Sophia, leading them away from the door and deeper into the lab. As they moved through the darkness, Jae-hwan stumbled upon a ventilation shaft. It was their only hope. "In here," he whispered, pushing Ji-hyun and Sophia into the shaft. As they climbed up the shaft, Jae-hwan could hear the zombies shuffling and groaning below. He knew they had to move fast. Finally, they reached the roof, where they found themselves surrounded by a sea of zombies. But Jae-hwan spotted something in the distance, a helicopter, hovering above the city. Without hesitation, Jae-hwan grabbed Ji-hyun and Sophia's hands, and they made a run for the helicopter. They sprinted across the rooftop, zombies closing in on all sides. As they reached the edge of the roof, Jae-hwan leapt into the air, grabbing onto the helicopter's landing gear. He pulled Ji-hyun and Sophia up behind him, and they collapsed onto the floor of the helicopter. As the helicopter lifted off, Jae-hwan looked down at the city below. It was a sea of chaos and destruction, with zombies swarming through the streets. But Jae-hwan knew they had to keep moving. They had to find a way to stop the outbreak and restore order to the city. The helicopter banked and turned, heading towards the outskirts of the city. Jae-hwan looked over at Ji-hyun and Sophia, who were staring back at him with a mix of fear and determination. "What's next?" Ji-hyun asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jae-hwan's eyes narrowed. "We find the source of the outbreak," he said. "And we put an end to it." The helicopter flew over the outskirts of the city, the landscape below growing increasingly desolate. Jae-hwan, Ji-hyun, and Sophia were on a mission to find the source of the outbreak. As they flew, Jae-hwan's mind was racing. He knew that finding the source of the outbreak was their only hope of stopping it. But he also knew that it wouldn't be easy. The helicopter suddenly banked and turned, heading towards a large complex in the distance. Jae-hwan's eyes narrowed as he looked at the complex. "What is this place?" Ji-hyun asked, her voice filled with curiosity. Sophia looked up from the map she was studying. "This is the location of the research facility where the outbreak originated," she said. Jae-hwan's eyes locked onto the facility. "This is it," he said. "This is where we'll find the source of the outbreak." As the helicopter landed, Jae-hwan, Ji-hyun, and Sophia jumped out, their guns at the ready. They moved cautiously towards the facility, their eyes scanning the surrounding area for any signs of danger. As they entered the facility, they were met with an eerie silence. The halls were empty, the only sound the creaking of the old building. Jae-hwan's eyes narrowed as he moved through the halls. He knew that they were getting close to the source of the outbreak. Suddenly, they heard a noise. Footsteps, coming from the lab at the end of the hall. Jae-hwan's grip on his gun tightened. "Get ready," he whispered. As they approached the lab, Jae-hwan could feel his heart pounding in his chest. What would they find inside? Jae-hwan slowly pushed open the door to the lab, his gun at the ready. Ji-hyun and Sophia followed close behind, their eyes scanning the room for any signs of danger. The lab was in disarray, equipment smashed and papers scattered everywhere. But what caught Jae-hwan's attention was the large containment cell in the center of the room. Inside the cell, Jae-hwan saw a figure. It was a woman, her eyes wild and her skin gray. She was pounding on the glass, her mouth open in a silent scream. Jae-hwan's eyes narrowed. This must be the source of the outbreak. Suddenly, the woman's eyes locked onto Jae-hwan, and she stopped pounding on the glass. She stared at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and desperation. Jae-hwan felt a chill run down his spine. There was something unsettling about the woman's gaze. "What is she?" Ji-hyun whispered, her eyes fixed on the woman. Sophia shook her head. "I don't know," she said. "But I think she's the key to stopping the outbreak." Jae-hwan's eyes never left the woman. "We need to get her out of there," he said. But as they approached the containment cell, the woman's eyes flashed with anger. She began to pound on the glass again, her mouth open in a silent scream. Jae-hwan's heart sank. They were running out of time. Jae-hwan, Ji-hyun, and Sophia carefully approached the containment cell, trying not to startle the woman inside. As they got closer, Jae-hwan could see the desperation in her eyes. "We're here to help you," Jae-hwan said, trying to sound calm. The woman's pounding on the glass slowed, and she looked at Jae-hwan with a mixture of confusion and hope. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jae-hwan explained their situation, and the woman listened intently. As he finished, she nodded slowly. "I'm Dr. Kim," she said. "I was working on a cure for cancer. But something went wrong. The virus mutated, and this happened." Ji-hyun's eyes widened. "You're the one who created the outbreak?" she asked. Dr. Kim nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry," she said. I never meant for this to happen. Sophia stepped forward. We need to get you out of there, she said. We need to find a way to stop the outbreak. Dr. Kim nodded. I think I can help you, she said. But we have to be careful. The virus is highly contagious. If we're not careful, we'll all be infected. Jae-hwan's eyes narrowed. We'll take that risk, he said. We have to stop this outbreak. Dr. Kim nodded, a determined look on her face. Let's do it, she said. As they carefully released Dr. Kim from the containment cell, Jae-hwan couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could stop the outbreak and restore order to the city. But as they turned to leave, Jae-hwan heard a noise behind them. He turned to see a horde of zombies shambling towards them, their eyes fixed on Dr. Kim. Jae-hwan's heart sank as he saw the horde of zombies approaching. They were surrounded, and Dr. Kim was still weak from her ordeal. We have to get out of here, now. Jae-hwan yelled, grabbing Dr. Kim's arm and pulling her towards the door. But it was too late. The zombies were already closing in, their jaws snapping wildly. Jae-hwan, Ji-hyun, and Sophia fought bravely, but they were vastly outnumbered. Just when it seemed like all was lost, Dr. Kim suddenly remembered something. The lab's security system, she exclaimed. I can activate it and seal off the area. Jae-hwan's eyes lit up with hope. Do it, he yelled. Dr. Kim frantically worked the controls, and suddenly the lab was filled with the sound of alarms and hissing gas. The zombies stumbled and fell, incapacitated by the security system. As the gas cleared, Jae-hwan and the others made a run for the door. They emerged from the lab, gasping for air, and looked around frantically for a way to escape. That's when they saw it, a helicopter, hovering above the rooftops. Jae-hwan's heart leapt with hope. Let's go, he yelled, grabbing Dr. Kim's arm and pulling her towards the helicopter. As they flew away from the lab, Jae-hwan looked back at the city below. It was a scene of utter chaos and destruction, but he knew that they had to keep fighting. They had to find a way to stop the outbreak, no matter what it took. As they flew over the city, Jae-hwan couldn't help but feel a sense of despair. The outbreak had spread too far, and he wasn't sure if they could stop it. But Dr. Kim's voice brought him back to reality. We have to get to the CDC, she said. They have the equipment and expertise to develop a cure. Jae-hwan's eyes narrowed. The CDC is on the other side of the city, he said. It's going to be a tough journey. Dr. Kim nodded. I know, she said. But we have to try. As they flew towards the CDC, they encountered numerous obstacles. Zombies swarmed the streets, and other survivors tried to attack them. But Jae-hwan, Ji-hyun, and Sophia fought bravely, determined to reach the CDC and find a cure. Finally, after what seemed like hours, they arrived at the CDC. It was a heavily fortified building, surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by soldiers. Jae-hwan's heart leapt with hope as they landed on the rooftop. They were finally safe. But as they entered the building, they were met with a shocking sight. The CDC was in chaos, with scientists and soldiers running wildly through the halls. What's going on? Jae-hwan asked, grabbing a nearby soldier. The soldier's eyes were wild with fear. It's too late, he said. The outbreak has spread too far. We can't stop it. Jae-hwan's heart sank. Was it really too late? Jae-hwan's eyes narrowed as he listened to the soldier's words. He couldn't accept that it was too late. They had come too far, fought too hard. We need to talk to the director, Jae-hwan said, his voice firm. The soldier nodded, leading them to the director's office. Inside, they found a harried-looking woman, surrounded by papers and computers. Director Kim, Jae-hwan said, his voice respectful. We've come from the lab where the outbreak started. We have Dr. Kim with us, and she thinks she can create a cure. Director Kim's eyes widened as she looked at Dr. Kim. Is this true? She asked. Dr. Kim nodded. I think I can create a cure, but I need your help. We need to use the CDC's resources to mass-produce the cure. Director Kim nodded, a determined look on her face. We'll do it, she said. But we have to act fast. The outbreak is spreading by the minute. Jae-hwan nodded, a sense of hope rising in his chest. They could do this. They could stop the outbreak. As they worked tirelessly to create the cure, Jae-hwan couldn't help but think about the journey they had been on. They had lost so much, but they had also found something, a sense of purpose, a sense of hope. And as they finally held the cure in their hands, Jae-hwan knew that it had all been worth it. But as they turned to leave, they were met with a shocking sight. A horde of zombies, led by the monstrous creature that had been terrorizing the city, was shambling towards them. "It's not over yet," Jae-hwan said, his voice grim. The final battle was about to begin. Jae-hwan, Ji-hyun, Sophia, and Dr. Kim stood shoulder to shoulder, ready to face the horde of zombies. They had the cure, but they knew it wouldn't mean anything if they couldn't survive to distribute it. The zombies shambled closer, their eyes fixed on the group. Jae-hwan raised his gun, taking aim at the monstrous creature leading the horde. "You take care of the others," Jae-hwan said to Ji-hyun and Sophia. "I'll take care of that thing." Ji-hyun and Sophia nodded, taking aim at the surrounding zombies. Dr. Kim stood behind them, clutching the cure tightly. As the zombies closed in, Jae-hwan took a deep breath and fired. The bullet hit the monstrous creature right between the eyes, but it didn't fall. Instead, it let out a deafening roar and charged towards Jae-hwan. He dodged to the side, avoiding the creature's outstretched arms. Ji-hyun and Sophia were fighting off the surrounding zombies, but there were too many of them. They were starting to get overwhelmed. Dr. Kim saw her chance and made a run for it, dashing towards the CDC's broadcast center. She had to get the cure to the world, no matter what. As Jae-hwan fought off the monstrous creature, he saw Dr. Kim's plan. He knew he had to give her time. With a fierce determination, Jae-hwan launched himself at the creature, fighting with every ounce of strength he had. The battle was intense, with zombies and the monstrous creature closing in on all sides. But Jae-hwan refused to give up. He fought for Dr. Kim, for Ji-hyun and Sophia, and for the future of humanity. And as the fight raged on, Jae-hwan knew that this was it. This was the final battle. Jae-hwan fought with every ounce of strength he had, but the monstrous creature was relentless. It knocked him to the ground, its jaws snapping wildly. Just as all hope seemed lost, Ji-hyun and Sophia arrived, guns blazing. They fired at the creature, trying to distract it long enough for Jae-hwan to escape. But the creature was too powerful. It swatted Ji-hyun and Sophia aside like flies, sending them crashing to the ground. Jae-hwan knew he had to act fast. With a surge of adrenaline, he launched himself at the creature, tackling it to the ground. The two of them wrestled, punching and kicking, as the zombies closed in. Jae-hwan knew he couldn't hold out much longer. Just as the creature was about to deliver the final blow, Dr. Kim's voice rang out over the loudspeakers. "Attention, attention. We have a cure for the zombie virus. Repeat, we have a cure." The zombies paused, momentarily stunned. Jae-hwan took advantage of the distraction to land a devastating kick, sending the monstrous creature crashing to the ground. As the zombies began to dissipate, confused and disoriented, Jae-hwan stumbled to his feet. He was battered and bruised, but he was alive. Ji-hyun and Sophia rushed to his side, helping him to stand. Together, they looked out over the city, watching as the zombies slowly disappeared. It was over. The outbreak was finally under control. As the three of them hugged, tears of relief streaming down their faces, Dr. Kim's voice came over the loudspeakers once more. "We did it," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "We saved the world." The city was rebuilt, the survivors slowly rebuilding their lives. Jae-hwan, Ji-hyun, and Sophia became heroes, hailed for their bravery and selflessness. Dr. Kim's cure was distributed worldwide, eradicating the zombie virus once and for all. And as for Jae-hwan, he finally found the peace he had been searching for. He knew that he had made a difference, that he had helped save humanity from the brink of destruction.